Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into something that will make your worst Tinder date look like a fairy tale. We're exploring marriage in ancient China, where meeting the parents happened before you even met your spouse. Fortune tellers had more say in your love life than you did, and compatibility was measured by whether your zodiac animals could peacefully coexist. From tea ceremonies, more elaborate than royal coronations, to concubines who basically ran the empire from their bedrooms, ancient Chinese marriage was part romantic drama, part political chess match, and entirely dependent on how much silk your family could afford. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So you're living in ancient China, maybe during the Han Dynasty, maybe the Tang. You're of marrying age, which could be anywhere from 14 to 20, depending on your family's status and the emperor's current policies on population growth. You've been practicing your calligraphy, learning to play the guqin, and perfecting your tea pouring technique. You're ready for love, ready for romance, ready to meet your soulmate. Unfortunately, you're not meeting anyone because you've probably never been alone with a member of the opposite sex in your entire life, and your parents have already picked out your spouse using a combination of family wealth, social status, and whether a fortune teller thinks your birth dates are cosmically compatible. Welcome to ancient Chinese courtship, where love was optional, but financial security and ancestral approval were absolutely mandatory. In ancient China, marriage wasn't about individual happiness. It was about family alliances, bloodline continuation, and making sure your ancestors didn't spend eternity disappointed in your life choices. The phrase "marriages are made in heaven" took on literal meaning here, because families consulted astrologers, fortune tellers, and sometimes the I Ching, just to make sure the cosmic forces weren't going to curse their union with bad luck, poverty, or sons who grew up to be terrible at poetry. Your parents, or more accurately your father, would begin the matchmaking process by consulting a go-between, usually a professional matchmaker who knew every eligible family within a reasonable travel distance. This wasn't your friendly neighborhood grandmother with opinions about your love life. This was a businesswoman who kept detailed records of family lineages, financial assets, and which households had produced children with promising examination scores. The matchmaker would present your family with potential candidates, complete with what basically amounted to ancient Chinese dating profiles. Except instead of enjoys long walks on the beach, it was more like family-owned 17 acres of productive rice paddies. Eldest son passed the county-level examinations. No history of mental illness or gambling addiction in the immediate bloodline. If you were a young woman, your value was calculated based on your family's status, your dowry, your domestic skills, and whether you had small feet. If you were a young man, it was about your family's wealth, your potential for passing the civil service examinations, and whether you seemed likely to produce sons who wouldn't disgrace the family name. Romance. That was something that happened in poetry and opera, not in real life. Real life was about ensuring that your great-great-grandchildren would have enough rice to eat and a respectable ancestral tablet to bow to. The entire process could take months or even years. Families would exchange detailed information about bloodlines going back several generations, because marrying someone whose great-uncle had been executed for treason could reflect poorly on your family's judgment for centuries to come. They'd investigate each other's financial situations with the thoroughness of modern tax auditors, and consult various spiritual authorities to make sure the match wouldn't anger any deceased relatives. And you, the actual person getting married? You were mostly just waiting to be told who you'd be spending the rest of your life with, hoping they weren't too old, too cruel, or too fond of gambling away the family fortune on cricket fights. But hey, at least you didn't have to worry about making conversation on a first date. Once your families had decided you were cosmically and financially compatible, it was time for the 6 rituals, an elaborate process that made modern wedding planning look like a casual barbecue. These weren't suggestions or traditional guidelines. These were serious ceremonial requirements that could take months to complete properly. And skipping any of them was basically announcing to your community that you didn't respect tradition, your ancestors, or the fundamental order of the universe. The first ritual was the proposal, which sounds romantic, until you realize it involved your families exchanging formal letters that read more like business contracts than love declarations. The groom's family would send an official matchmaker to the bride's family with a proposal that included detailed information about the groom's character, education, and prospects. The bride's family would then spend several days or weeks consulting fortune tellers, examining the groom's family history, and basically conducting what amounted to an ancient background check. If the bride's family approved, they'd send back an acceptance letter that was just as formal and businesslike. Congratulations, you were now engaged to someone you'd probably never had a conversation with. The second ritual was the name asking, where the groom's family would formally request the bride's birth date and time so they could have astrologers determine whether the marriage would be blessed by heaven or cursed by cosmic forces. This wasn't just curiosity about zodiac signs. Ancient Chinese astrology was incredibly complex, involving not just the year you were born but the exact month, day, and hour. Astrologers would create detailed charts showing how your cosmic energies would interact, whether your marriage would produce sons, and whether you'd be financially prosperous or spend your lives as disappointed rice farmers. If the astrologer declared the match favourable, you moved on to the third ritual, auspicious omen. This involved the groom's family sending gifts to the bride's family, usually including items like wine, food, silk, and sometimes livestock. These weren't wedding presents, they were formal tokens of commitment, and the specific items and quantities were determined by complex social protocols. Send too little, and you'd insult the bride's family. Send too much, and you'd appear to be showing off, or suggesting the bride's family was poor. The fourth ritual was the Great Betrothal, which was basically ancient China's version of an engagement party, except it involved more ceremonies and less champagne. The groom's family would send a formal delegation to the bride's family with elaborate gifts including things like bolts of silk, jars of wine, and various symbolic items that represented prosperity, fertility, and harmony. The bride's family would accept these gifts in a formal ceremony, and from that moment, the engagement was considered binding. Breaking an engagement after this point wasn't just socially awkward, it was a serious matter that could result in legal consequences and social disgrace. The fifth ritual was choosing the date, which sounds simple until you remember that in ancient China, timing was everything. Families would consult multiple calendars, lunar, solar, and astrological, to find a date that was auspicious for weddings. This meant avoiding days associated with death, conflict, or bad harvests, and choosing a time when cosmic forces would bless the union. Some months were considered entirely unsuitable for weddings, some years were better than others. Finding the perfect date could take months of consultation with various spiritual authorities. The sixth and final ritual was the actual wedding ceremony, which we'll get to later. But by the time you reached your wedding day, you'd already been through 5 elaborate ceremonies that had taken months to complete, and probably cost your families more than most people earned in a year. And through all of this, the bride and groom were mostly just along for the ride, watching their families orchestrate their future, with the precision of military strategists planning a campaign. Let's talk about dowries, because in ancient China, no marriage was complete without a thorough financial negotiation that would make modern prenups look casual and trusting. And the dowry system in ancient China was fascinating and complex. Unlike some cultures where the groom's family paid the bride's family for the privilege of marrying their daughter, Chinese dowries worked both ways. The bride's family would prepare a dowry for their daughter, and the groom's family would provide what was called a bride price to the bride's family. It was less buying a wife and more expensive gift exchange that determined your social status for the rest of your life. If you were a bride, your dowry was essentially your life insurance policy. This wasn't just wedding gifts from your parents. This was property, money, household items, and sometimes even land that would belong to you personally after marriage. A good dowry could include silk clothing, jewelry, furniture, tea sets, books, musical instruments, and various household goods. Wealthy families might include shops, farmland, or even servants. The dowry served multiple purposes. First, it demonstrated your family's wealth and status. A lavish dowry announced to the community that your family was prosperous and respected. Second, it provided financial security in case your husband turned out to be a disaster. Since divorce was difficult and often socially ruinous, your dowry was your backup plan. Third, It gave you some degree of independence and respect within your new household, because you weren't arriving empty-handed. But preparing a dowry could bankrupt families. Some parents spent years accumulating the necessary goods for their daughter's marriage. They'd save money, purchase silk, commission furniture, and sometimes go into debt to ensure their daughter married respectably. The pressure was enormous, because a small or inadequate dowry could result in a daughter being treated poorly by her new family, or worse, being unable to marry at all. The groom's family, meanwhile, was expected to provide a bride price that demonstrated their wealth and respect for the bride's family. This could include money, silk, food, wine, livestock, and various luxury items. The bride price wasn't payment for the bride, it was compensation to her family for losing her labour and companionship, and recognition of the expense they'd invested in raising and educating her. These negotiations could become incredibly complex. Families would haggle over the exact contents of dowries and bride prices, like merchants negotiating trade agreements. Mediators and matchmakers would spend weeks working out details, making sure both sides felt respected, and neither family was financially ruined by the marriage. And here's where it gets interesting. Sometimes the bride price and dowry would be roughly equivalent, meaning families were essentially exchanging similar values. Other times, one side would significantly outspend the other, creating a power imbalance that would affect the marriage for years to come. Wealthy families used dowries and bride prices as displays of status, sometimes spending enormous sums to demonstrate their importance. Poor families might pull resources from extended relatives, or go into debt, or simply resign themselves to modest exchanges that reflected their economic reality. The entire system created enormous pressure on parents. Raise a daughter, and you'd need to provide her with a dowry substantial enough to secure a good marriage. Raise a son, and you'd need to accumulate enough wealth to afford the bride price for a suitable wife. Have multiple children, and you might spend decades planning and saving for their marriages. And through all of this financial complexity, the bride and groom were often completely uninvolved in the negotiations. They'd learn about their dowry or bride price after everything had been decided, and then spend their married lives living with the economic arrangements their parents had made on their behalf. Romance might have been optional, but accounting was definitely required. In ancient China, marrying someone without consulting an astrologer was like performing surgery without washing your hands. Technically possible, but considered incredibly foolish and likely to end in disaster. Chinese astrology didn't just influence marriage decisions, it completely controlled them. The process began with something called matching the 8 characters, or bazi. Every person's birth was recorded not just by date, but by the exact year, month, day, and hour, according to the traditional Chinese calendar. Each of these time periods was associated with one of 12 earthly branches and 10 heavenly stems, creating a complex astrological profile that supposedly revealed everything about your personality, destiny, and compatibility with potential spouses. An astrologer would take the birth information from both the prospective bride and groom and create detailed charts showing how their cosmic energies would interact. This wasn't just about whether you were both born in the year of the dragon. This was serious mathematical calculation involving cycles of elements, planetary influences, and cosmic forces that required years of study to understand properly. The astrologer would examine dozens of factors. Were your birth elements compatible? Fire and water might cancel each other out, but wood and earth could create harmony. Did your birth animals get along? A tiger and a monkey might create conflict, but a rabbit and a pig could bring peace and prosperity. Were you born under auspicious stars, or were there cosmic influences that might bring bad luck to the marriage? Some combinations were considered so incompatible that marriage was absolutely forbidden. Others were deemed perfect matches blessed by heaven. Most fell somewhere in between, with astrologers providing detailed advice about timing, ceremonies, and precautions that could improve the cosmic outlook for the union. The zodiac animals played a particularly important role. Each year was associated with one of 12 animals: rat, ox, tiger, rabbit, dragon, snake, horse, goat, monkey, rooster, dog, and pig. But it wasn't just about the year. The month, day, and hour of birth each had their own animal associations, creating a complex profile that supposedly revealed compatibility. Some animal combinations were considered highly auspicious. Dragons and phoenixes, represented by roosters, were thought to create powerful, harmonious marriages. Rats and oxen were considered practical and prosperous matches. Tigers and horses might create passionate but unstable unions. Other combinations were seen as potentially disastrous. Tigers and monkeys were thought to create conflict and competition. Roosters and dogs might bring arguments and discord. Snakes and pigs could result in deception and betrayal. But beyond the basic animal compatibility, astrologers would examine the complex interactions between elements, directions, and cosmic forces. Your birth chart would be analysed for influences from metal, wood, water, fire, and earth. The direction you were born facing, the season of your birth, and even the weather conditions could all influence your marital compatibility. If the astrologer found serious incompatibilities, the marriage could be called off entirely. Some families would wait years to find cosmically compatible matches for their children. Others would seek multiple astrological opinions, hoping to find an astrologer who would give them the answer they wanted. When a good match was found, the astrologer would not only approve the marriage, but provide detailed instructions for the wedding ceremony. The date and time had to be astrologically perfect. The direction the bride entered her new home mattered. Even the colours worn during the ceremony were chosen based on cosmic influences. This system put enormous power in the hands of astrologers, who could essentially veto any marriage by declaring it cosmically incompatible. Some astrologers were highly respected scholars, who took their responsibilities seriously. Others were charlatans, who adjusted their predictions based on how much families were willing to pay for favourable readings. And the bride and groom? They were completely at the mercy of cosmic forces they probably didn't understand, hoping their birth dates would align favourably with someone they'd never met, so they could marry with the blessing of heaven and the approval of their ancestors. Because in ancient China, love might be unpredictable, but the stars were supposed to be eternal. When your wedding day finally arrived in ancient China, it wasn't just a celebration, it was a complex theatrical performance with a cast of hundreds, elaborate costumes, and enough ritual symbolism to keep anthropologists busy for decades. The day began before dawn, with the bride undergoing a transformation ritual that would have impressed modern makeover shows. She'd be dressed in layers of silk robes, typically red for good fortune, though the exact colours and patterns varied by dynasty and social class. Her hair would be arranged in an elaborate style, specific to married women, often involving complex braids, ornaments and accessories that took hours to complete properly. The most famous part of the bridal costume was often the phoenix crown, an ornate headdress decorated with gold, pearls, and precious stones arranged in the pattern of the mythical phoenix. Only the bride was allowed to wear phoenix imagery on her wedding day, symbolizing her transformation from maiden to wife. The entire outfit could weigh dozens of pounds and cost more than most families earned in several years. Meanwhile, the groom would be dressed in equally elaborate robes, often featuring dragon imagery to complement the bride's phoenix. The dragon and phoenix together represented the perfect balance of masculine and feminine energy, imperial power, and harmonious marriage. The ceremony began with the groom travelling to the bride's family home in a formal procession. This wasn't just the groom walking over to pick up his bride. This was a parade involving musicians, banner carriers, gift bearers, and various family members, all dressed in their finest clothing and following specific protocols about who walked where and in what order. The groom would arrive at the bride's home and participate in several rituals before being allowed to see her. He might have to answer riddles posed by her family, participate in tea ceremonies, or perform various symbolic acts that demonstrated his worthiness and respect for her family. The bride, meanwhile, would be waiting in her family home, often behind screens or veils, participating in farewell rituals with her own family. This was supposed to be an emotional time, as she was leaving her birth family forever to join her husband's household. In many cases, she might not see her parents again for months or years. The actual moment when the bride left her family home was highly ritualized. She couldn't simply walk out the front door. Instead, she had to be carried out, often in an elaborate sedan chair called a bridal sedan, which was decorated with red silk, flowers, and auspicious symbols. The bride was not supposed to touch the ground during the journey to her new home, symbolizing her transition from one family to another without being contaminated by earthly influences. The bridal procession from the bride's home to the groom's home was often the most spectacular part of the entire celebration. Musicians would play traditional wedding music, firecrackers would be set off to ward away evil spirits, and the entire procession would wind through the streets so the community could witness and bless the union. When the bride arrived at her new home, she couldn't simply enter through the front door. Instead, she had to step over a saddle for peace and a lit brazier for purification, while family members scattered rice and beans for fertility and red dates and peanuts for sons. The core of the wedding ceremony was the tea service, where the bride and groom would serve tea to the groom's parents and extended family in order of seniority. This wasn't just politeness, it was the formal recognition of the bride's new place in the family hierarchy. Each family member would accept the tea and give the couple gifts of money or jewelry, officially welcoming the bride into the family. After the tea ceremony came the actual marriage vows, which were nothing like modern wedding vows. Instead of declaring their love for each other, the bride and groom would bow to heaven and earth, to the ancestral tablets, and to their parents, formally acknowledging their duties to continue the family line and honor their ancestors. The celebration would continue with elaborate banquets featuring foods chosen for their symbolic meaning: fish for abundance, noodles for longevity, dates for fertility, lotus seeds for many sons. The number of courses, the specific dishes, and even the way food was presented all carried symbolic significance. But here's the fascinating part. Through this entire elaborate ceremony, the bride and groom might still barely know each other. They'd been through months of preparation, but the actual couple was often secondary to the spectacle their families had created. The wedding night brought its own rituals, including customs designed to ensure fertility and ward off evil spirits. But after all the ceremony, symbolism and celebration, the bride and groom would finally be alone together for the first time, hoping that all the cosmic calculations, family negotiations, and ritual preparations would somehow translate into a happy marriage. Now let's talk about one of the most complex aspects of ancient Chinese marriage, the concubine system. Because in ancient China, if you were wealthy enough, marriage wasn't just about finding one person to spend your life with. It was about creating an entire household of women with carefully defined roles, responsibilities, and levels of status. First, let's clarify terminology, because the concubine system was far more nuanced than most people realize. There was the primary wife, called the main wife, or Genki, who held the highest status and whose children would be considered the primary heirs. Then there were secondary wives called little wives, or Chi-Chi, who had formal recognized status but ranked below the main wife. Finally, there were concubines, who were essentially servants, who also served as the master's sexual partners. The main wife was chosen with the same elaborate process we've already discussed: family negotiations, astrological consultations, and formal ceremonies. She was expected to manage the household, produce sons, and maintain the family's social status. Her position was secure and legally protected. Secondary wives and concubines, however, existed in a much more precarious situation. They could be purchased, given as gifts, or taken as war prizes. Some were former servants who had attracted their master's attention. Others were women from poor families who had been sold to wealthy households. A few were educated women who had become concubines for financial security or social advancement. The hierarchy within these households could be incredibly complex. The main wife held supreme authority over all the other women, but secondary wives might outrank certain concubines based on factors like the status of their own families, whether they had produced sons, or how much favor they held with the husband. Concubines who produced sons could see their status rise dramatically, as the sons were considered legitimate heirs, even though their mothers weren't wives. Some concubines became incredibly powerful by producing multiple sons, or by gaining political influence through their relationships with their masters. The most famous example of concubine power is probably Yang Guifei during the Tang dynasty, who became the beloved concubine of Emperor Xuanzong. She wielded enormous political influence, promoted her family members to high positions, and essentially ruled the empire through her relationship with the emperor. Her story didn't end well. She was eventually blamed for military disasters and executed. But for years she was one of the most powerful people in China, despite technically being just a concubine. Managing a household with multiple wives and concubines required diplomatic skills that would have impressed modern UN peacekeepers. The main wife had to balance maintaining her own authority with keeping peace among women who were essentially competing for the same man's attention and resources. Jealousy, intrigue, and political maneuvering were constant features of these households. Women would form alliances, plot against rivals, and use their children as pawns in complex power games. Some concubines would try to poison or sabotage their rivals. Others would attempt to gain favour through exceptional beauty, intelligence, or sexual skills. The legal and social protections for concubines varied enormously depending on their specific status and the wealth and character of their masters. Some lived lives of luxury and influence. Others were essentially slaves who could be sold, beaten, or abandoned at will. For the men who maintained these households, the concubine system served multiple purposes beyond sexual gratification. It demonstrated wealth and status. Only rich men could afford to support multiple women. It increased the chances of producing male heirs, which was crucial for continuing the family line, and it provided a ready workforce of women to manage various household tasks. But the system also created enormous financial pressure. Supporting multiple wives and concubines, along with their children and servants, could bankrupt even wealthy families. Some men spent their entire fortunes trying to maintain the lifestyle that their status demanded. The emotional toll on everyone involved was often severe. Wives lived with the constant knowledge that their husbands were sleeping with other women. Concubines faced lives of uncertainty and dependence. Children born to different mothers often grew up in competition with each other for inheritance and status. And yet, for many women, becoming a concubine to a wealthy man offered better prospects than remaining in poverty or marrying a poor husband. Some concubines received educations, lived in luxury, and wielded real power within their households. The concubine system reflected the harsh realities of a society where women had few legal rights and limited economic opportunities. It wasn't necessarily about romance or desire, it was about survival, status, and the complex negotiations of power within patriarchal households. Modern people often view the concubine system as evidence of ancient Chinese misogyny, and there's certainly truth to that interpretation. But it's also important to understand that within the constraints of their society, some women found ways to use the system to gain influence, security, and even a form of independence. Divorce in ancient China was theoretically possible, but practically speaking, it was about as easy as convincing a dragon to become a vegetarian. The legal and social structures were designed to make marriage permanent, and dissolving a union required navigating a maze of regulations, social stigma, and family honor that made most people prefer to suffer in silence rather than attempt escape. The legal framework for divorce was based on 7 grounds for divorcing a wife, which sounds progressive until you realize these were 7 reasons a husband could divorce his wife, not 7 ways a marriage could be mutually dissolved. These grounds included disobedience to parents-in-law, failure to produce sons, adultery, jealousy, hereditary disease, theft, and talkativeness. Let's unpack these, because they reveal fascinating assumptions about marriage and gender roles. Disobedience to parents-in-law meant that if your mother-in-law didn't like you, your marriage could be terminated. Failure to produce sons could end a marriage even if the wife had given birth to multiple daughters. Jealousy was grounds for divorce, meaning a wife wasn't supposed to complain about her husband's concubines or secondary wives. But here's where it gets interesting. There were also 3 prohibitions against divorce, which protected wives in certain circumstances. A husband couldn't divorce his wife if she had properly mourned his parents for 3 years, if her family had risen in social status since the marriage, or if she had nowhere to return to because her birth family was dead or destitute. These prohibitions reveal something important. Divorce wasn't just about the relationship between husband and wife, it was about the relationships between families, the social obligations created by marriage, and the practical realities of women's economic dependence. For women, divorce was generally catastrophic. A divorced woman faced enormous social stigma and had very limited options for supporting herself. She might return to her birth family if they would accept her, but many families viewed a divorced daughter as a shameful burden. Remarriage was possible, but difficult, as divorced women were considered less desirable than widows or unmarried women. Some divorced women became concubines to other men, essentially accepting a lower social status in exchange for security. Others entered religious life, becoming Buddhist nuns or Taoist practitioners. A few might support themselves through crafts, trade, or entertainment, but these were often precarious existences, on the margins of society. For men, divorce was easier, but still complicated. While a man could theoretically divorce his wife for the 7 prescribed reasons, he also had to consider the reactions of both families, the fate of any children, and the financial implications of dissolving the marriage bonds. Interestingly, some of the most powerful divorces in Chinese history involved women who refused to accept passive dismissal. Empress Wu Zetian, who eventually became the only woman to rule China in her own right, began her political career as a concubine who was supposed to be sent to a nunnery after her imperial lover died. Instead, she seduced the next emperor, eliminated her rivals, and eventually took power herself. But for every Wu Zetian, there were thousands of women who quietly endured unhappy marriages because the alternatives were worse. The social and economic structures made marriage a necessity for most women, regardless of personal happiness or compatibility. Some couples found creative ways to escape unbearable marriages without formal divorce. Men might abandon their wives by leaving for extended periods, traveling for business, taking civil service positions in distant provinces, or simply disappearing. Women had fewer options for escape, but some ran away to join religious communities, fled to relatives in distant cities, or occasionally committed suicide as a form of protest against intolerable conditions. The children of divorced parents faced their own challenges. Sons typically remained with their father's family, while daughters might be sent with their mother or kept by the father's family, depending on their ages and the specific circumstances of the divorce. These separations could be permanent, with children never seeing their divorced mothers again. Remarriage for divorced men was generally straightforward, though they might face questions about why their first marriages had failed. Remarriage for divorced women was more complex, often involving acceptance of lower status marriages or relationships that provided security without legal recognition. The entire system reflected the reality that marriage in ancient China was primarily an economic and social institution rather than a romantic one. When marriages failed, the solutions were designed to protect family honor and financial interests rather than individual happiness or emotional well-being. Yet despite all these obstacles, some people did find ways to escape unhappy marriages and build new lives. The historical records include stories of divorced women who became successful merchants, divorced men who found happiness in second marriages, and couples who managed to dissolve their unions and remain on friendly terms. The difficulty of divorce also meant that many couples who might have separated in other societies instead found ways to coexist peacefully within unhappy marriages. Some developed separate lives within the same household. Others found companionship with concubines, friends, or spiritual practices that provided fulfillment outside the marriage relationship. The wedding night in ancient China was often the first time a bride and groom would be truly alone together, which created a unique situation where two complete strangers were expected to immediately begin the intimate relationship that would define the rest of their lives. The pressure surrounding the wedding night was enormous, not just for the couple, but for their entire families. The consummation of the marriage was considered essential for validating the union, and there were various customs designed to ensure fertility and marital harmony from the very first night. Before the couple retired to their wedding chamber, there were often rituals performed to bless their union and encourage fertility. Family members might scatter red dates, peanuts, and other symbols of fertility on the marriage bed. Sometimes children would be invited to jump on the bed to bring luck for producing sons. Herbs and incense might be burned to create an auspicious atmosphere. The bride would often receive instruction from older female relatives about her marital duties, though this education was typically limited and euphemistic. Many brides entered marriage with little understanding of physical intimacy, having been sheltered from such knowledge throughout their upbringing. Grooms, particularly from wealthy families, might have more experience with concubines or courtesans, but they also faced pressure to perform well on their wedding night. The groom's family would be watching for signs that the marriage had been properly consummated, and failure could bring shame and questions about the couple's fertility. After the wedding night, the couple would begin the delicate process of learning to live together as strangers who were now expected to function as intimate partners. This transition could take months or years, and success often depended more on mutual respect and patience than on romantic love. Some couples developed genuine affection over time, shared experiences like managing a household, raising children, and facing family crises could create bonds that grew into love. Other couples maintained polite but distant relationships, fulfilling their marital duties without ever achieving real intimacy. The early months of marriage were often dominated by the wife's adjustment to her new family's household. She had to learn the preferences and routines of her mother-in-law, establish relationships with other family members, and find her place in the complex hierarchy of an extended family household. For the husband, marriage often meant taking on new responsibilities for supporting not just his wife, but potentially her extended family as well. The dowry and bride price negotiations had created financial obligations that could last for years. The pressure to produce children, particularly sons, began immediately after marriage. Families would anxiously watch for signs of pregnancy, and a wife who didn't conceive quickly might face questioning, herbal remedies, and visits to various spiritual practitioners for fertility blessings. Intimate relationships in these arranged marriages varied enormously, depending on the personalities and circumstances of the individuals involved. Some couples discovered sexual compatibility, despite having never chosen each other. Others struggled with physical intimacy throughout their marriages. The presence of concubines and secondary wives in wealthy households complicated these intimate relationships. A primary wife might find herself competing for her husband's attention and affection with women who had been chosen for their beauty or sexual skills, rather than their family connections. Some marriage manuals from ancient China provide fascinating insights into how couples were expected to conduct their intimate lives. These texts often combined practical advice about sexual techniques with philosophical discussions about the balance of yin and yang energies in marital relationships. The concept of sexual harmony was important in Chinese culture, with intimate relationships seen as part of the larger cosmic balance between masculine and feminine forces. Good sexual relationships were thought to promote health, longevity, and spiritual well-being for both partners. But the reality was that many couples had to navigate intimate relationships without much guidance or preparation. They learnt through trial and error, influenced by cultural expectations, family pressure, and their own personal discoveries about compatibility and desire. Pregnancy and childbirth brought new dynamics to these relationships. A wife who successfully produced sons would see her status rise dramatically within the household. The intimate relationship might become more affectionate as the couple shared the experience of parenthood. However, the high rates of maternal and infant mortality meant that pregnancy and childbirth were also sources of anxiety and grief. Many couples experienced multiple miscarriages, stillbirths, or infant deaths, which could strain their relationships or bring them closer together through shared loss. As marriages matured, couples often developed patterns of intimacy that reflected their individual personalities and circumstances. Some maintained passionate relationships throughout their lives. Others settled into companionate marriages based on mutual respect and shared responsibilities rather than physical desire. Children in ancient Chinese marriages weren't just beloved family members. They were the entire point of the marriage, the justification for the elaborate ceremonies, and the insurance policy for the family's continued existence. The pressure to produce offspring, particularly male offspring, shaped every aspect of married life and created complex family dynamics that could span generations. The birth of a son was cause for major celebration, involving elaborate rituals, gifts from extended family, and ceremonies to introduce the new heir to the ancestors. Sons would carry on the family name, inherit property, and take responsibility for caring for aging parents and maintaining ancestral worship. They were also expected to produce the next generation of male heirs, continuing the family line indefinitely. Daughters, while loved, served different purposes in the family structure. They would eventually marry out of the family, taking their childbearing potential to their husbands' households. However, daughters could also serve important functions as connections between families, and some daughters of powerful families wielded considerable influence through their marriages. The pressure on wives to produce sons was enormous and unrelenting. A woman who gave birth only to daughters might face criticism, blame, and even replacement by concubines brought in specifically to produce male heirs. The irony, of course, is that the sex of children is determined by the father's genetic contribution, but ancient Chinese families didn't understand genetics. They understood family honor and the need for sons. Pregnancy was surrounded by elaborate rituals and superstitions designed to ensure healthy births and male children. Pregnant women were given special foods, required to avoid certain activities, and often confined to specific areas of the house to protect both mother and child from harmful influences. Family members would consult fortune tellers, make offerings to various deities, and follow complex protocols about what the expectant mother could see, hear, or experience. The birth itself was a major family event, with midwives, female relatives, and various spiritual practitioners, all involved in ensuring a safe delivery. If the child was male, celebrations would begin immediately. If female, the reaction was more subdued, though daughters were still welcomed as valuable family members who would eventually create connections with other families through marriage. Childhood in wealthy families was highly structured, with different expectations for sons and daughters from an early age. Sons would begin their education in classical literature, calligraphy, and preparation for civil service examinations. Daughters would learn domestic skills, musical instruments, and the social graces necessary for advantageous marriages. The inheritance system created complex family dynamics that could last for generations. In theory, the eldest son inherited the majority of family property and assumed responsibility for caring for his parents and maintaining the ancestral shrine. Younger sons might receive smaller portions or be expected to make their own way in the world through military service, commerce, or scholarly achievement. However, the presence of multiple wives and concubines complicated inheritance dramatically. Children born to the primary wife had higher status than those born to secondary wives or concubines. But all were considered legitimate heirs. A son born to a beloved concubine might receive more inheritance than the eldest son of an unloved primary wife, depending on the father's preferences and family politics. Some families attempted to avoid inheritance disputes by clearly defining the roles and expectations for each child from birth. Others allowed competition between children, believing it would motivate them to achieve greatness. Many families experienced bitter conflicts between half-siblings that lasted for decades and sometimes resulted in violence, legal battles, or permanent family divisions. The care of aging parents was both a moral obligation and a legal requirement, with children who failed to provide adequate support facing social condemnation and sometimes legal punishment. This system meant that producing children wasn't just about family continuity, it was about ensuring security in old age. Parents often played favourites among their children, investing more resources in those who showed promise for bringing honour and prosperity to the family. A son who demonstrated scholarly ability might receive extensive education and support for civil service examinations, while his brothers were directed toward military service or commerce. A daughter who was exceptionally beautiful or talented might receive special training to prepare her for marriage to a particularly advantageous family. The emotional relationships between parents and children in these arranged marriage families varied enormously. Some parents developed deep affectionate bonds with their children, while others maintained formal, distant relationships focused on duty and obligation rather than emotional intimacy. Children in these families learned early that their individual desires were secondary to family needs and expectations. They were expected to marry whom their parents chose, pursue careers that brought honour to the family, and prioritise family loyalty over personal happiness. This system produced some remarkably accomplished individuals who achieved great success within its constraints, but it also created tremendous pressure and limited personal freedom. The death of children was tragically common, with high rates of infant and childhood mortality, creating constant anxiety for parents. Families might lose multiple children to disease, accident, or other causes, and the grief was compounded by concerns about family continuity and the loss of investments in education and preparation for adulthood. Despite all the practical considerations, financial negotiations, and family politics surrounding ancient Chinese marriage, the question remains, did people actually fall in love? The answer is complex, fascinating, and reveals something important about human nature's ability to find affection even within the most structured circumstances. Love in arranged marriages often developed gradually, built on shared experiences rather than initial attraction. Couples who began as strangers might discover compatibility through daily interactions, mutual respect through facing challenges together, and affection through the intimate knowledge that comes from sharing a life. Some of the most touching love stories in Chinese literature and history involve couples who found genuine romance within arranged marriages. The poet Li Qingzhao and her husband Zhao Mingcheng, married through family arrangement, developed a passionate intellectual and romantic partnership that produced some of China's greatest poetry. Their relationship demonstrates how arranged marriages could sometimes create ideal partnerships when the individuals involved were well matched in temperament and interests. The development of love in these marriages often followed predictable patterns. Initial politeness and mutual assessment would gradually give way to familiarity and comfort. Shared experiences like managing a household, dealing with difficult relatives, or facing financial challenges could create bonds of mutual dependence and respect. Physical intimacy, initially awkward between strangers, might develop into genuine passion as couples learned each other's preferences and desires. The birth of children often deepened emotional connections as couples shared the intense experiences of pregnancy, childbirth, and child-rearing. However, the structure of marriage in ancient China also created obstacles to romantic love. The presence of mothers-in-law who maintained authority over young wives could prevent couples from developing independent relationships. The expectation that husbands would take concubines could create jealousy and emotional distance between spouses. Some couples found ways to create privacy and intimacy within the constraints of extended family households. They might develop private communication through poetry, share secret jokes or references, or create small rituals that belonged only to them. Gardens, libraries, and private chambers could become spaces where couples retreated from family obligations to focus on their relationship. The Chinese literary tradition includes many examples of husbands and wives who maintain lifelong romantic relationships despite having been brought together through arrangement. These couples often express their love through poetry, calligraphy, and artistic collaboration rather than through the public displays of affection that were considered inappropriate. Some marriages produced love that was passionate and all-consuming. Others developed into deep friendships based on mutual respect and shared goals. Still others remained cordial but distant partnerships focused on fulfilling social obligations rather than personal fulfillment. The concept of romantic love wasn't entirely absent from ancient Chinese culture. It was simply channeled into different contexts. Young people might experience passionate attractions to individuals they could never marry, and these feelings were often expressed through poetry, music, and art. The literature is full of stories about unrequited love, forbidden romance, and the tension between duty and desire. Interestingly, some of the most passionate love affairs in Chinese history occurred between people who were already married to others. These relationships were often conducted through poetry and letters, with physical meetings being rare and dangerous. The intensity of these connections sometimes stemmed from their impossibility. The knowledge that they could never result in marriage made them both more precious and more poignant. Concubines and secondary wives sometimes developed genuine romantic relationships with their masters, despite the inherent inequality of their positions. Some of these relationships involved real emotional intimacy and mutual care, though they always existed within the context of male authority and female dependence. The most successful arranged marriages seem to be those where both partners approach the relationship with realistic expectations and a willingness to build affection gradually. Couples who expected immediate passionate love were often disappointed, while those who focused on developing mutual respect and companionship might discover that love could grow over time. Letters and poetry from historical couples reveal that many arranged marriages did produce genuine love, though it might be expressed differently than in cultures where romantic love was the primary basis for marriage. Chinese couples often wrote about their appreciation for each other's character, their gratitude for partnership in facing life's challenges, and their joy in shared accomplishments and experiences. Death was a constant presence in ancient Chinese households, and the loss of a spouse created complex situations that involved not just grief and emotional adjustment, but also questions of property, family status, and social expectations that could determine the rest of a person's life. When a husband died, his widow faced immediate and dramatic changes in her circumstances. Her status within the household, her financial security, and her future options all depended on factors like her age, whether she had produced sons, the size of her dowry, and the attitudes of her deceased husband's family. Young widows with sons were generally expected to remain in their husband's household and dedicate themselves to raising their children and caring for their in-laws. These women could achieve considerable respect and authority within the family structure, essentially becoming the guardians of their son's inheritance and the preservers of their husband's lineage. However, young widows without children, or with only daughters, faced much more precarious situations. They might be encouraged or pressured to remarry, particularly if they were still of childbearing age. Alternatively, they might be expected to remain in their husband's household as essentially unpaid caretakers for aging in-laws, with no real authority or security. The ideal of widow fidelity became increasingly important in later Chinese history, with widows who remained unmarried after their husbands' deaths being praised as models of virtue and devotion. Some widows chose this path voluntarily, finding meaning in maintaining their connection to their deceased husbands and focusing on raising their children or serving their families. Others found the expectations of permanent widowhood unbearable and sought ways to remarry despite social pressure. Remarriage for widows was possible but complicated, often involving acceptance of lower status marriages or relationships that provided security without full social recognition. When wives died, particularly young wives, the situation was quite different. Widowed husbands were generally expected to remarry relatively quickly, both to ensure the continuation of the family line and to provide proper household management. The death of a wife was seen as a practical problem to be solved, rather than a reason for extended mourning or permanent celibacy. However, some husbands did develop deep emotional attachments to their wives and found remarriage difficult or unappealing. Historical records include stories of men who remained devoted to their deceased wives' memory, sometimes maintaining shrines to them or refusing to remarry despite family pressure. The death of children, tragically common in ancient China, created different kinds of grief and adjustment. The loss of sons was particularly devastating for families, as it threatened the continuation of the family line and could invalidate years of investment in education and preparation for adulthood. Some couples found that shared grief over lost children brought them closer together, while others were driven apart by blame, different coping mechanisms, or the pressure to produce replacement heirs quickly. The death of multiple children could create lasting trauma that affected marriages for years. Widowhood also created opportunities for some women to achieve independence and authority that would have been impossible during their marriages. Wealthy widows who inherited property or businesses sometimes became powerful figures in their communities, managing commercial enterprises or wielding political influence through their sons or other male relatives. The most successful widow managers often were those who had developed good relationships with their husbands' extended families and who possessed the practical skills necessary for household and business management. These women could find widowhood liberating, despite the social restrictions and emotional challenges. Some widows chose to enter religious life, becoming Buddhist nuns or Taoist practitioners. This path offered spiritual fulfillment and community, though it meant renouncing any possibility of remarriage or secular authority. Religious communities sometimes provided more egalitarian environments, where women could achieve recognition for their spiritual accomplishments rather than their family connections. The treatment of widows varied significantly across different historical periods and social classes. During some dynasties, widows enjoyed more legal protections and social respect. During others, they were seen as burdens on their families and encouraged to disappear quietly from public life. Remarriage customs also varied by region and time period. In some areas, widow remarriage was common and accepted. In others, it was stigmatized as evidence of insufficient devotion to the deceased husband. These attitudes could change dramatically based on practical considerations like war casualties, economic conditions, or population pressures. The children of remarried widows faced their own challenges, particularly regarding inheritance rights and family loyalty. Step families could be sources of conflict, support, or complex emotional relationships that lasted for generations. Marriage in ancient China was never purely personal. It was always political to some degree. But at the highest levels of society, marriages became instruments of statecraft, diplomacy, and power that could determine the fate of dynasties and shape the course of history. Imperial marriages were the most obviously political, with emperors' wives chosen to cement alliances with powerful families, regions, or even foreign kingdoms. The selection of an empress wasn't just about finding someone compatible with the emperor, it was about balancing the power of different court factions and ensuring political stability. The process of choosing an imperial consort could take years and involve elaborate competitions where young women from prominent families were evaluated not just for beauty, but for their family connections, education, political reliability, and potential for producing male heirs. These selections could elevate entire families to positions of enormous power or destroy them if they fell from favour. Some imperial marriages were genuinely affectionate partnerships that combined political necessity with personal compatibility. The Tang Dynasty Emperor Xuanzong's relationship with Yang Guifei began as political calculation, but developed into a passionate love affair that influenced imperial policy for decades, ultimately contributing to one of the greatest military disasters in Chinese history, when his devotion to her alienated his generals and led to rebellion. Other imperial marriages were purely strategic arrangements, where the personal feelings of the participants were entirely irrelevant. Emperors might marry daughters of rival families to neutralize threats, or take wives from border regions to secure frontier territories. These political brides often lived isolated lives in the imperial palace, serving as hostages for their family's good behavior rather than as genuine partners. The families of imperial consorts could achieve incredible wealth and influence through these marriages, but they also faced constant danger. If their daughter fell from imperial favor, or if political winds shifted, entire families could be executed, exiled, or stripped of their positions overnight. Foreign marriages were another important political tool, with Chinese dynasties sometimes arranging marriages between imperial relatives and foreign rulers to secure alliances, trade agreements, or peace treaties. These marriages often involved sending Chinese princesses to foreign courts, where they served as diplomatic representatives as well as wives. The most famous example is probably Wang Zhaojun, who was sent to marry a Han chieftain during the Han dynasty as part of a peace agreement. Her story became legendary in Chinese literature, often portrayed as a beautiful, educated woman who sacrificed her personal happiness for the good of the empire. At lower levels of the aristocracy, marriages were also used to build political networks, secure business relationships, and create alliances between families with different resources and connections. A military family might marry into a scholarly family to gain access to civil service positions, while a wealthy merchant family might marry into the nobility to acquire social status. These political marriages created complex webs of obligation and mutual dependence that could last for generations. Families would trace their relationships through marriage connections, using these links to secure favors, gather information, and advance their interests in court politics or business dealings. The success of political marriages often depended on the personalities and skills of the individuals involved. Some political brides became powerful figures who used their positions to advance their family's interests and shape policy. Others remained passive instruments of their family's ambitions, with little personal agency or influence. Marriage alliances could also become sources of conflict when political circumstances changed. Families that had been allies through marriage might find themselves on opposite sides of succession disputes, rebellions, or policy debates. These situations could create terrible dilemmas for individuals who had to choose between loyalty to their birth families and loyalty to their marriage families. The children of political marriages often faced particular pressures and opportunities. They inherited complex networks of family relationships that could provide advantages in pursuing careers or marriages of their own, but they also carried the burden of family expectations and political obligations that limited their personal freedom. Some of the most dramatic political marriages involved attempts to resolve succession crises or legitimize claims to power. Marrying into the previous ruling family could provide legitimacy for new dynasties, while strategic marriages between potential heirs could sometimes prevent civil wars or consolidate power after military victories. The institution of political marriage also created opportunities for women to wield real power, albeit always within the constraints of patriarchal systems. Some empresses, empress dowagers, and powerful consorts effectively ruled empires through their positions as wives or mothers of emperors, demonstrating that the personal could indeed become political in the most literal sense. Marriage in ancient China wasn't just about the wedding ceremony, It was about creating and maintaining a web of traditions, celebrations, and customs that reinforced family bonds and social connections throughout the year. These ongoing traditions were often more important for the long-term success of marriages than the elaborate wedding ceremonies that began them. The most significant ongoing tradition was the annual celebration of wedding anniversaries, though these weren't marked in the same way as modern anniversary celebrations. Instead, couples would participate in seasonal festivals and family ceremonies that reinforced their roles as married partners and their connections to extended family networks. The Spring Festival, marking the Lunar New Year, was particularly important for married couples. This was when families gathered to honor their ancestors, renew family bonds, and celebrate the coming year. Newly married wives would participate in elaborate preparations, demonstrating their integration into their husband's family and their skills in managing household celebrations. The food prepared for these festivals carried deep symbolic meaning related to marriage and family prosperity. Long noodles represented longevity for the marriage, whole fish symbolized abundance, and various sweets and fruits were chosen for their associations with fertility and happiness. The preparation and presentation of these foods was often a collaborative effort that helped build relationships between women in extended family households. Mid-Autumn Festival, celebrating the harvest moon, was another important occasion for married couples. The round moon was seen as a symbol of family unity and completion, and families would gather to admire the moon, share mooncakes, and recite poetry about love, separation, and reunion. For couples in arranged marriages, these festivals provided opportunities to develop shared traditions and create positive memories together. Dragon Boat Festival, Qingming, Tomb Sweeping Festival, and various other seasonal celebrations all included specific customs related to marriage and family relationships. These ongoing traditions helped reinforce the social bonds created by marriage and provided structure for couples learning to live together as partners. Food played a particularly important role in maintaining matrimonial harmony. Chinese cuisine includes numerous dishes that were specifically associated with marital happiness, fertility, and family prosperity. The preparation and sharing of these foods was considered both practical nourishment and symbolic communication about the state of family relationships. Wives were generally responsible for managing household food preparation, which gave them significant authority within the domestic sphere. A wife who was skilled at cooking could earn respect and affection from her husband's family, while culinary failures could be sources of criticism and tension. The tea ceremony, which we mentioned in the wedding context, continued to be important throughout married life. The daily serving of tea to elderly family members was a way for married couples to demonstrate their respect for family hierarchy and their commitment to maintaining proper relationships within the household. Regional variations in matrimonial traditions were enormous across China's vast territory. Northern families might emphasize different foods, ceremonies, and customs than southern families. Ethnic minorities maintained their own distinct traditions that often blended with Han Chinese customs through intermarriage and cultural exchange. Some regions had unique traditions like return visits, where newly married wives would return to their birth families for extended visits during specific seasons or festivals. These visits helped maintain connections between families and gave wives opportunities to seek advice, support, and emotional refreshment away from their marriage households. Gift-giving traditions also continued throughout marriages, with specific occasions calling for exchanges of presents between families, spouses, and extended relatives. These gifts weren't just personal gestures, they were important communications about family status, financial well-being, and the health of relationships between connected households. The religious and spiritual aspects of matrimonial traditions varied depending on family beliefs and regional customs. Buddhist families might participate in temple ceremonies, seeking blessings for marital harmony and family prosperity. Taoist traditions included various practices for maintaining balance and harmony in household relationships. Confucian families emphasized ceremonies that reinforced proper social hierarchies and moral behavior. Seasonal traditions also provided structure for the intimate aspects of marriage. Certain times of year were considered more auspicious for conception, while others were thought to be better for focusing on spiritual development or family business. These beliefs influenced when couples might be most sexually active and when they might focus on other aspects of their relationship. The maintenance of matrimonial traditions required significant time, energy, and financial resources, which meant that the most elaborate customs were generally limited to wealthy families. However, even poor families participated in simplified versions of many traditions, demonstrating the importance of these customs across all levels of society. Health and medicine played crucial roles in ancient Chinese marriage, influencing everything from mate selection to daily married life to the tragic reality of high mortality rates that could end marriages suddenly and without warning. During the matchmaking process, families paid careful attention to the health histories of potential spouses. A family history of certain diseases, physical disabilities, or mental illness could disqualify otherwise suitable candidates. Astrologers and fortune tellers were sometimes consulted to determine whether potential matches might be prone to health problems based on their birth dates and cosmic influences. Traditional Chinese medicine also influenced ideas about sexual compatibility and marital harmony. The concepts of yin and yang, hot and cold constitutions, and the balance of bodily energies were all considered important factors in creating successful marriages. Couples with complementary health profiles were thought to be more likely to maintain good health and produce healthy children. Pregnancy and childbirth were major health concerns that dominated the lives of married women. Traditional Chinese medicine included elaborate systems for maintaining health during pregnancy, preventing miscarriages, and ensuring safe deliveries. These medical traditions combined herbal remedies, dietary restrictions, acupuncture, and various spiritual practices. The high rates of maternal mortality meant that pregnancy was always dangerous, and many marriages were ended by the death of wives during childbirth. This reality influenced family planning decisions and created constant anxiety for married couples hoping to produce children safely. Infant and childhood mortality rates were also devastating, with many families losing multiple children to diseases that are easily treatable today. These losses created enormous grief for married couples and could strain marriages as partners coped with repeated trauma and the pressure to continue attempting to produce surviving heirs. Traditional Chinese medicine included various treatments specifically for marital problems. Herbal remedies were prescribed for sexual dysfunction, infertility, and relationship conflicts. Some practitioners specialized in treating women's diseases and advising on matters related to marriage and reproduction. The concept of sexual health was more sophisticated in ancient China than in many other cultures of the time. Medical texts included detailed discussions of sexual techniques, the importance of mutual satisfaction in marriage, and the health benefits of harmonious sexual relationships. These ideas influenced educated couples' approaches to intimacy within marriage. Mental health was also recognized as important for marital success, though understanding and treatments were limited by the knowledge of the time. Conditions like depression, anxiety, and what we might now recognize as post-traumatic stress were sometimes treated with herbal medicine, meditation, and changes in diet or lifestyle. The seasonal rhythms of traditional Chinese medicine influenced many aspects of married life. Certain times of year were considered better for conception, while others were thought to be more suitable for celibacy and spiritual focus. These beliefs affected couples' intimate relationships and family planning decisions. Longevity practices, including dietary therapy, exercise systems like qigong, and various forms of meditation, were often pursued by married couples together. These shared health practices could become important bonding activities that strengthened marriages while promoting physical and mental well-being. Traditional Chinese medicine also included various contraceptive methods, though their effectiveness was limited and their use was often discouraged by families hoping for more children, particularly sons. Some women used herbal preparations, timing methods, or physical techniques to prevent pregnancy. Though these methods were often dangerous and unreliable, the treatment of sexually transmitted diseases was another important medical concern affecting marriage. Ancient Chinese medical texts describe various conditions that we would now recognize as STDs, along with treatments that were sometimes effective but often harmful. The presence of such diseases could seriously damage marriages and family relationships. Aging and its effects on marital relationships were also addressed by traditional medicine. Remedies for maintaining sexual function, preventing age-related diseases, and promoting longevity were pursued by married couples hoping to maintain active, healthy relationships throughout their lives. The integration of medical care with other aspects of married life meant that health concerns were never purely personal matters. They were family concerns that affected economic planning, social status, and the success of marriage alliances between families. China's vast territory and diverse population meant that marriage customs varied enormously across different regions, ethnic groups, and historical periods. What we often think of as ancient Chinese marriage was actually a complex tapestry of different traditions that evolved and influenced each other over thousands of years. In northern China, particularly around the imperial capitals, marriage customs tended to be more formal and influenced by Confucian ideals of social hierarchy and proper behavior. These regions emphasized elaborate ceremonies, strict adherence to the 6 rituals, and careful attention to social status in matchmaking. The climate and agricultural patterns also influenced timing of weddings, with most ceremonies taking place during favorable seasons when families could afford the expense and time for celebrations. Southern China developed somewhat different traditions, often influenced by the warmer climate, different agricultural cycles, and the cultural diversity created by interactions with non-Han ethnic groups. Southern families sometimes placed more emphasis on commercial success and practical skills in evaluating potential spouses, reflecting the region's greater involvement in trade and commerce. The Yangtze River Valley, with its prosperous agricultural economy, developed marriage traditions that emphasized family wealth and the importance of maintaining productive farmland through strategic marriages. The region's prosperity allowed for elaborate wedding celebrations, but also created pressure for marriages that would preserve and expand family fortunes. Border regions, where Chinese families interacted with nomadic peoples, Tibetan communities, and Southeast Asian cultures, developed hybrid marriage customs that blended Chinese traditions with local practices. These marriages sometimes served diplomatic functions, cementing alliances between different ethnic groups or facilitating trade relationships. Ethnic minorities within Chinese territory maintained their own distinct marriage traditions, which sometimes influenced and were influenced by Chinese customs. Tibetan marriage practices, with their acceptance of polyandry and different inheritance patterns, were quite different from Han Chinese norms. Various Turkic peoples in Western China had their own customs related to bride price, wedding ceremonies, and family structure. The Hakka people, who migrated from northern China to the south over several centuries, maintained distinctive marriage customs that reflected their history as a displaced people. Hakka women often had more freedom and authority than women in other Chinese communities, and their marriage practices reflected these different gender roles. Urban and rural differences were also significant. City dwellers, particularly merchants and artisans, sometimes developed more flexible marriage customs that emphasized commercial partnerships and practical skills over traditional status considerations. Rural families, more dependent on agriculture and traditional social structures, tended to maintain more conservative practices. Economic differences created variations in marriage customs that could be dramatic even within the same region. Wealthy families could afford elaborate ceremonies, extensive dowries, and complex household arrangements with multiple wives and concubines. Poor families had to make do with simpler ceremonies and more practical arrangements focused on survival and mutual support. Different historical periods also saw significant changes in marriage customs. The Tang dynasty, with its cosmopolitan culture and relative openness to foreign influences, had somewhat different marriage practices than the more conservative Song dynasty. The Yuan dynasty, established by Mongol conquerors, introduced new elements that influenced Chinese marriage customs, while the Ming dynasty saw a return to more traditional Confucian practices. Religious differences also influenced marriage customs. Buddhist families might emphasize different values and practices than Taoist families. Folk religious traditions, which varied significantly across different regions, contributed additional diversity to marriage customs and celebrations. The influence of local dialects and languages also affected marriage customs, particularly in regions where multiple languages were spoken. Marriage negotiations, wedding ceremonies, and ongoing family relationships had to navigate linguistic differences that could create both opportunities and challenges for cross-cultural marriages. Climate and geography influenced many practical aspects of marriage customs. Families in mountainous regions had different challenges and opportunities than those in river valleys or coastal areas. These environmental factors affected everything from wedding timing to dowry composition to the kinds of economic partnerships that marriages created. Trade routes and commercial connections also influenced regional marriage customs. Families involved in long-distance trade often developed marriage practices that could accommodate extended separations and cross-regional relationships. These commercial marriages sometimes created networks that spanned vast distances and connected diverse communities. The legacy of these regional variations can still be seen in contemporary Chinese marriage customs, which continue to reflect the diversity and complexity of China's cultural heritage, despite modernization and political changes. Despite all the formal arrangements, astrological consultations, and family negotiations that dominated ancient Chinese marriage, the human heart refused to be completely controlled by social conventions. Hidden beneath the surface of arranged marriages and rigid family hierarchies was a rich world of secret romance, passionate poetry, and clandestine relationships that reveals the eternal struggle between duty and desire. The Chinese literary tradition is filled with stories of forbidden love that flourished in the margins of respectable society. These weren't just fictional fantasies, they reflected real experiences of people who found themselves drawn to relationships that their families and society would never approve. Poetry became the primary vehicle for expressing forbidden emotions. Young scholars would compose verses about unreachable beauties, married women would write about longing and loneliness, and separated lovers would communicate through elaborate metaphors that disguised their true feelings from censorious family members. The tradition of palace poetry included countless poems about court ladies pining for distant lovers or emperors who had forgotten them in favor of newer favorites. The most poignant poems often came from women trapped in unsatisfying marriages, who used literature to express emotions they couldn't share with anyone in their actual lives. Li Qingjiao, despite her famous happy marriage, also wrote heartbreaking verses about separation and loss that resonated with countless women experiencing their own forms of emotional isolation. Letter writing provided another outlet for romantic expression, though it was extremely dangerous. Secret correspondence between lovers required elaborate arrangements involving trusted servants, sympathetic relatives, or professional go-betweens who specialized in facilitating clandestine communications. These letters had to be written in code, or hidden in seemingly innocent messages about other topics. Some of the most passionate love letters in Chinese literature were exchanged between people who knew they could never be together. Buddhist monks and nuns, despite their vows of celibacy, sometimes carried on intense emotional relationships through letters that combined spiritual discussion with barely disguised romantic longing. Married people separated by distance, military service, or political circumstances poured their hearts into letters that might take months to reach their destinations. The physical dangers of secret romance were enormous. Discovery could result in execution, exile, or social disgrace for everyone involved. Families would go to extreme lengths to prevent or punish unauthorized romantic relationships, seeing them as threats to carefully negotiated marriage alliances and family honor. Yet people continued to take these risks, suggesting that the need for emotional and romantic fulfillment was stronger than fear of punishment. Historical records include numerous scandals involving court ladies, government officials, Buddhist clergy, and ordinary citizens who were caught in unauthorized romantic relationships. Some secret romances involved elaborate schemes worthy of spy novels. Lovers would meet in temples, gardens, or abandoned buildings, using servants as lookouts and developing complex systems of signals to avoid detection. Wealthy men sometimes maintained secret households for unofficial wives or lovers, while women found ways to communicate with admirers through seemingly innocent activities like religious pilgrimages or visits to female relatives. The concept of romantic friendship also provided cover for relationships that might otherwise be considered inappropriate. Men and women could sometimes maintain intense emotional connections under the guise of scholarly collaboration, artistic patronship, or spiritual guidance. These relationships might never become physical, but they could provide the emotional intimacy that was often missing from arranged marriages. Courtesans and entertainers occupied a unique position in this secret world of romance. These women were often highly educated and artistically accomplished, capable of providing intellectual and emotional companionship that men might not find in their wives. Relationships with courtesans were semi-acceptable for married men, existing in a grey area between respectable marriage and scandalous adultery. Some of the most famous romances in Chinese history began as relationships between married men and courtesans, who eventually became concubines or secondary wives. These relationships could develop into genuine partnerships that lasted for decades, though they always remained secondary to the men's official marriages. The seasonal rhythms of Chinese society provided opportunities for secret romance during festivals, pilgrimages, and other occasions when normal social restrictions might be relaxed. Young people could sometimes meet at temple fairs, opera performances, or family celebrations, using these public gatherings to make connections that could develop into clandestine relationships. Religious sites were particularly important venues for secret romance. Temples, monasteries, and pilgrimage destinations provided legitimate reasons for people to travel and meet outside their normal social circles. The spiritual atmosphere also seemed to inspire romantic feelings, perhaps because religious settings emphasized emotions and transcendence over practical considerations. The language of flowers, colors, and symbolic objects allowed lovers to communicate without words. A particular arrangement of flowers, the choice of clothing colors, or the positioning of personal objects could convey complex messages between people who couldn't speak openly about their feelings. Music and performance also provided outlets for romantic expression. Professional musicians and opera performers could sing about love and longing in ways that would be inappropriate in normal conversation. Audiences could project their own romantic fantasies onto these performances, finding vicarious satisfaction in artistic representations of the passionate relationships they couldn't have in real life. The tragedy of most secret romances was that they could rarely be sustained indefinitely. Social pressure, family obligations, and practical necessities usually forced people to abandon unauthorized relationships and return to the marriages and duties that society expected of them. The literature is full of stories about lovers who are separated by family opposition, political changes, or their own decisions to prioritize duty over desire. Yet, these secret romances served important functions beyond providing emotional fulfillment for the individuals involved. They preserved ideas about romantic love and individual choice that might otherwise have been completely suppressed by social conventions. They provided inspiration for artists and writers who created works that spoke to universal human experiences of love and longing. And they reminded everyone that the human heart could not be completely controlled by even the most rigid social systems. Ancient Chinese marriage was deeply intertwined with beliefs about supernatural forces, spiritual influences, and magical practices that could determine whether a union would be blessed with happiness or cursed with misfortune. These beliefs weren't just quaint folklore, they were serious considerations that could make or break marriage negotiations and influence every aspect of married life. The process of choosing an auspicious wedding date involved consulting multiple calendars, astronomical charts, and spiritual authorities to find a time when cosmic forces would favor the union. This wasn't just about avoiding obviously inauspicious dates like the anniversary of a family death or during mourning periods. It required understanding complex interactions between lunar cycles, solar terms, and the movements of various celestial bodies. Certain months were considered completely unsuitable for weddings. The 7th lunar month, known as Ghost Month, was avoided because the spirits of the dead were thought to be particularly active and might interfere with the happiness of the living. The 3rd month was sometimes avoided because its name sounded like the word for scattered, which could bring bad luck to the marriage. Even specific days within acceptable months had to be carefully evaluated. Days associated with particular animals from the zodiac cycle might be favourable or unfavourable depending on the birth years of the bride and groom. Days ruled by certain elements could enhance or conflict with the cosmic energies of the couple. The direction the bride entered her new home was considered crucial for the success of the marriage. Feng Shui principles dictated that she should approach from the direction most favourable to her birth year and element, while avoiding directions that might bring conflict or misfortune. Some families would actually modify their homes or construct temporary pathways to ensure the bride entered from the correct direction. Wedding ceremonies included numerous practices designed to ward off evil spirits and attract good fortune. Firecrackers weren't just for celebration, they were believed to frighten away malevolent spirits who might try to curse the new marriage. Red decorations, clothing, and accessories were chosen because red was thought to be a powerful color for repelling evil influences. The bride's wedding outfit often included hidden talismans, protective charms, and symbolic objects designed to ensure fertility, happiness, and protection from spiritual harm. These might include small mirrors to reflect evil influences away from the bride, coins or precious metals for prosperity, and various plant materials associated with fertility and good luck. Food played an important role in marriage magic, with specific dishes chosen not just for their taste, but for their symbolic properties and supposed supernatural effects. Fish represented abundance, but they had to be prepared and served in particular ways to ensure the magic worked properly. Noodles had to be served uncut to ensure longevity for the marriage. Certain fruits and nuts were included because their names sounded like words for fertility or male children. Dream interpretation was another important aspect of marriage superstitions. Dreams experienced by either member of the couple or by their family members could be seen as omens about the success of the marriage. Prophetic dreams might reveal whether the union would produce sons, face financial difficulties, or encounter other specific challenges. Animal omens were carefully observed during wedding preparations and ceremonies. Birds, particularly magpies and phoenixes, were considered favorable omens for marriage. The appearance of certain animals during wedding festivities could be interpreted as signs of blessing or warning from spiritual forces. Weather conditions on the wedding day were also seen as omens. Rain could be interpreted as either a blessing, bringing fertility and abundance, or a curse, indicating tears and sorrow in the marriage, depending on the specific circumstances and regional traditions. Clear skies, gentle breezes, and mild temperatures were generally considered favorable signs. The condition of objects used in wedding ceremonies could also provide supernatural guidance. A broken mirror, torn fabric, or spilled wine during the ceremonies might be seen as ominous signs requiring immediate spiritual intervention to prevent bad luck in the marriage. Some families employed specialist practitioners who could perform protective rituals and magical ceremonies to ensure marriage success. These might include Taoist priests who could balance cosmic energies, Buddhist monks who could provide spiritual blessings, or folk magicians who specialized in love and fertility magic. Fertility magic was particularly important, given the enormous pressure on couples to produce children, especially sons. This could involve elaborate rituals performed before and after the wedding, special diets and treatments for the bride, and ongoing magical practices designed to encourage conception and ensure healthy births. Protective magic against adultery, divorce, and marital discord was also common. Some couples would participate in binding rituals designed to ensure mutual fidelity, or carry talismans that were supposed to strengthen their emotional connection and prevent outside interference in their relationship. The timing of sexual relations within marriage was often influenced by supernatural beliefs about when conception was most likely to occur and what kinds of children might be produced at different times. Certain lunar phases, seasonal periods, and astrological conditions were thought to be more favorable for producing male children or ensuring the health and intelligence of offspring. Some marriage superstitions focused on preventing specific misfortunes that were particularly feared. These might include rituals to prevent the husband from dying young, practices to ensure the wife wouldn't experience difficult childbirths, or ceremonies designed to protect the family from poverty or political persecution. Regional variations in marriage superstitions were enormous, with different areas developing their own specific beliefs and practices based on local spiritual traditions, historical experiences, and cultural influences. What was considered essential in one region might be completely unknown in another area just a few hundred miles away. The persistence of these supernatural beliefs throughout Chinese history suggests that they served important psychological and social functions beyond their supposed magical effects. They provided ways for people to feel some control over uncertain and dangerous life circumstances, created shared rituals that strengthened family bonds, and offered explanations for the inevitable difficulties and disappointments that most marriages encountered. Death was an ever-present reality in ancient Chinese marriages, with high mortality rates meaning that many unions ended not through choice, but through the loss of a spouse, often at relatively young ages. The elaborate customs surrounding death, mourning, and memorial in marriage reveal deep beliefs about the continuation of relationships beyond physical life and the responsibilities that survived even death. When a spouse died, the surviving partner faced not just emotional grief, but a complex set of social, legal, and spiritual obligations that could dominate their life for years. The period of mourning wasn't just about personal sorrow, it was a public demonstration of proper virtue, family loyalty, and respect for the social order that marriage represented. For wives who lost their husbands, the mourning period typically lasted 3 years, during which they were expected to withdraw from social activities, wear only white or undyed clothing, avoid cosmetics and jewelry, and demonstrate their grief through visible signs of suffering. This wasn't just custom, it was often legally enforced, with women who failed to mourn properly facing social ostracism or even legal punishment. The intensity of mourning expectations could be overwhelming. Widows were sometimes expected to sleep on straw mats, eat only simple foods, and avoid any activities that might suggest they were enjoying life despite their loss. Some widows took these expectations to extremes, damaging their health through excessive self-denial, or even committing suicide to demonstrate their devotion to their deceased husbands. For husbands who lost wives, mourning periods were typically shorter and less restrictive, reflecting the different social positions of men and women. However, men were still expected to show appropriate grief and respect, particularly if their wives had died in childbirth or while performing their duties as wives and mothers. The funeral ceremonies for married individuals were elaborate affairs that involved both families and could cost enormous amounts of money. The deceased spouse had to be honoured not just as an individual, but as a member of both their birth family and their marriage family, creating complex obligations for funeral arrangements, burial sites, and ongoing memorial practices. Burial customs reflected beliefs about the continuation of marriage relationships after death. Married couples were often buried together or in adjacent graves, with elaborate tomb furnishings that included items representing their married life together. Some tombs included symbolic representations of their household, complete with miniature servants, furniture, and domestic animals. The concept of ghost marriage reveals the extent to which marriage was seen as extending beyond death. When unmarried individuals died, their families sometimes arranged posthumous marriages to ensure they wouldn't be lonely in the afterlife. These ceremonies could be as elaborate as marriages between living people, complete with negotiations between families and formal ceremonies. Memorial practices kept the memory of deceased spouses alive through ongoing rituals and ceremonies. Surviving spouses were expected to maintain ancestral tablets representing their deceased partners, make regular offerings of food and incense, and include them in family celebrations and important decisions. The treatment of childless widows was particularly harsh, as they had no sons to care for them or maintain their memorial after their own deaths. These women often faced pressure to commit suicide, enter religious life, or accept positions as unpaid caretakers for their deceased husband's family, with little hope of independence or security. Some widows achieved remarkable independence and authority after their husbands' deaths, particularly if they had produced sons who inherited significant property or political positions. These women could become powerful matriarchs who wielded influence through their children and their control of family resources. The phenomenon of widow suicide, known as following in death, was sometimes praised as the ultimate demonstration of wifely virtue. Historical records include numerous accounts of wives who killed themselves after their husbands died, often by hanging, drowning, or taking poison. These deaths were sometimes commemorated with monuments and official recognition from imperial authorities. However, many widow suicides were actually the result of family pressure, economic desperation, or social circumstances that made continuing to live unbearable, rather than voluntary expressions of devotion. Some families actively encouraged or even forced widows to commit suicide to avoid the expense of supporting them or to enhance the family's reputation for virtue. The practice of remarriage for widows varied significantly across different time periods and social classes. During some dynasties, widow remarriage was relatively accepted and common. During others, it was heavily stigmatized and discouraged. These changing attitudes reflected broader social and political concerns about women's autonomy and family stability. Children who lost parents faced their own challenges in terms of mourning obligations and social expectations. Sons were expected to demonstrate filial piety through elaborate mourning practices that could interfere with their educations and careers. Daughters had different obligations, but were also expected to show appropriate grief and respect. The economic impact of spousal death could be devastating for surviving family members. The loss of a husband's income or a wife's domestic labor could push families into poverty. The expenses of proper funeral and mourning ceremonies could bankrupt families that were already struggling financially. Some families attempted to prepare for the possibility of spousal death through various insurance mechanisms. These might include savings specifically designated for funeral expenses, agreements with extended family members about mutual support, or religious practices designed to ensure favorable treatment in the afterlife. The spiritual beliefs surrounding death and marriage were complex and varied depending on family religious traditions. Buddhist concepts of rebirth suggested that deceased spouses might be reborn in new circumstances, while Confucian traditions emphasized the importance of maintaining memorial practices to honor their memory. Taoist beliefs included ideas about the possibility of spiritual reunion after death. Despite the formal requirements and social expectations surrounding death and mourning in marriage, the historical records also include evidence of genuine grief, love, and devotion between spouses who had developed deep emotional bonds despite having been brought together through arranged marriages. Some of the most moving poetry and literature in Chinese history was written by surviving spouses who used art to express their sorrow and preserve the memory of their lost partners. The marriage customs we've been exploring didn't disappear overnight. Instead, they evolved gradually over centuries, influenced by political changes, foreign contact, economic development, and shifting social values. Understanding how these ancient traditions changed helps us appreciate both their historical significance and their lasting influence on Chinese culture. The late imperial period saw gradual changes in marriage customs as China encountered increasing contact with Western ideas and technologies. Foreign missionaries, traders, and diplomats brought new concepts about individual choice, romantic love, and women's rights that slowly began to influence educated Chinese families. The examination system, which had long been crucial for determining marriage prospects, began to change as China modernized. New educational opportunities and career paths created different criteria for evaluating potential spouses, though traditional factors like family status and wealth remained important. Economic changes also influenced marriage customs. The growth of commercial cities created new opportunities for merchant families to achieve social status through wealth, rather than traditional scholarly achievement. These nouveau-rich families sometimes challenged established marriage customs by offering enormous dowries and bride prices that exceeded what traditional aristocratic families could afford. The Taiping Rebellion and other 19th-century upheavals disrupted traditional social structures and created new pressures on marriage customs. War, displacement, and economic chaos forced many families to abandon elaborate traditional ceremonies and focus on more practical arrangements for survival and mutual support. Foreign colonial presence in treaty ports introduced Chinese families to Western marriage customs directly. Some Chinese families began to adopt Western-style wedding ceremonies, while others maintained traditional practices but incorporated new elements like Western clothing or photography. The fall of the imperial system in 1911 marked a major turning point for marriage customs. The new Republic of China officially promoted ideas about gender equality and individual choice that challenged traditional, arranged marriage practices. However, social change was gradual, and many families continued to follow traditional customs for decades. The May 4th movement of 1919 brought renewed focus on modernizing Chinese marriage customs. Intellectuals and students advocated for free choice in marriage, gender equality, and the abandonment of practices like concubinage and foot binding that they saw as symbols of China's backwardness. New marriage law reforms during the Republican period began to provide legal protections for individual choice in marriage and women's rights within marriage. However, enforcement was uneven, and traditional practices remained strong in rural areas and conservative families. The Second Sino-Japanese War and subsequent civil war created additional pressures for change. Military conflicts separated families, disrupted traditional ceremonies, and created new urgencies around marriage and reproduction. Many couples married quickly in simplified ceremonies, before men left for military service. The establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949 brought systematic efforts to reform marriage customs. The new government promoted ideas about gender equality, free choice in marriage, and the elimination of feudal practices like arranged marriage and concubinage. However, the transition was not immediate or complete. Many families found ways to maintain traditional practices while adapting to new legal and social requirements. Arranged marriages continued in modified forms, with families providing guidance and suggestions rather than making binding decisions for their children. Economic reforms beginning in the 1980s created new pressures on marriage customs as China opened to global influences and market economics. Traditional values about family honor and social status remained important, but they were now expressed through different criteria like education, career success, and material prosperity. Contemporary Chinese marriage customs reflect this complex heritage. Modern Chinese weddings often combine traditional elements like tea ceremonies and red wedding dresses with contemporary practices like Western-style ceremonies and honeymoon trips. Dating and courtship now typically involve individual choice, but family input and approval remain important for many couples. The one-child policy and its recent relaxation have created new pressures around marriage and reproduction that echo some ancient concerns about family continuity and producing heirs. However, these modern concerns are expressed through very different social and economic contexts. Technology has also transformed how marriage connections are made, with online dating and social media replacing traditional matchmakers for many young people. However, some families still employ professional matchmakers who use modern methods to provide services similar to those of their ancient predecessors. The legacy of ancient Chinese marriage customs can be seen in contemporary practices, like the importance of family approval for marriages, the continued exchange of gifts and dowries, and the emphasis on marriage as a connection between families, rather than just between individuals. As we come to the end of our journey through the complex world of ancient Chinese marriage, it's worth reflecting on what these historical practices can teach us about love, relationships, and human nature. Perhaps the most striking lesson is that people throughout history have found ways to create meaningful relationships and build loving families within whatever social structures they inherited. The constraints of arranged marriage didn't prevent ancient Chinese couples from developing deep affection, mutual respect, and genuine partnership. Love, it seems, is remarkably adaptable. The elaborate customs and rituals we've explored weren't just empty traditions. They served important functions in helping strangers become partners, individuals become family members, and personal relationships become social institutions. While some of these practices seem foreign to modern sensibilities, they addressed universal human needs for security, belonging, and meaning. The emphasis on family connections and long-term stability in ancient Chinese marriage offers a counterpoint to contemporary focus on individual happiness and romantic fulfillment. Both approaches have their strengths and limitations, and perhaps the ideal lies somewhere between the complete arranged marriage of ancient China and the complete individual choice of modern Western culture. The stories of ancient Chinese couples also remind us that the challenges of marriage, learning to live with another person, balancing individual desires with family obligations, dealing with financial pressures and health problems, haven't changed much despite all our technological and social progress. What has changed is the range of choices available to people in creating their lives and relationships. Ancient Chinese couples had to find happiness within very restrictive circumstances, while modern couples sometimes struggle with too many options and too little guidance about how to build lasting relationships. The ancient Chinese understanding of marriage as a partnership that extends beyond the couple themselves to include families, communities, and future generations offers insights that might be valuable even in our individualistic age. The idea that marriage serves purposes beyond personal fulfillment, like caring for aging parents, providing stability for children, and maintaining social connections, remains relevant. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can appreciate both the freedoms you enjoy in choosing your own relationships and the wisdom embedded in ancient traditions that recognized marriage as one of humanity's most important and challenging endeavors. Whether your relationships are arranged by family or chosen by your own heart, the fundamental work of learning to love and live with another person remains the same. The ancient Chinese couples we've encountered tonight face their challenges with courage, creativity, and hope. Their stories remind us that love can flourish in unexpected places, that patience and kindness can overcome many obstacles, and that the human capacity for connection and care transcends any particular social system or historical period. Sweet dreams, and may your own relationships, however they began, be blessed with the kind of deep understanding and lasting affection that the best ancient Chinese marriages achieved, despite all their constraints and complications. So there you have it, marriage in ancient China, where love was optional, astrology was mandatory, and your mother-in-law really could end your marriage. At least when your relationships get complicated, you don't have to worry about whether your birth year is compatible with your partner's cosmic energy. Sweet dreams, everyone.